brand.
Pinche Gringo, Mexico is laughing thanks to you. We like to watch you dance salsa and listen to your bad Spanish too. We like to watch you almost die from spicy food. Pinche Gringo, Mexico just loves to make fun of you. For you we raise our prices and make your volume explode like ISIS. We won't mention the transvestite in Cancun. Ooh, Pinche Gringo.
Hey everybody,
What's up?
Welcome to the Pinche Gringo Podcast Loaded XL.
Yeah.
This is our first time that we're doing this on all of our platforms for Pinche Gringo, Pinche Bar, my own personal Facebook if my friends and family are joining, on our YouTube channel, on Insta and LinkedIn as well. We're all over the place in our new format. We're out of podcast
Locked and
purgatory,
Yeah.
audio purgatory, and we're here delivering to you all of the relevant information about Mexico and the United States, Americans and Canadians in Mexico. I forgot about Canada.
That's okay.
Not
Not the first time.
always forgetting about Canada, but we were going to deliver you all interesting things that are happening here in Mexico City as it pertains to Mexican and American culture in English, your source of different things, cultural things and events that are happening in the city when we get back to normal. Of course, we're in very special times with very special things happening, but tune in every week. We're going to have this podcast available. I guess it's not even a podcast anymore, right? We're going to have to change the name.
Opera now. It's a full-on locked and loaded version 3.6. We're excited. We got some ferns in the background. We've been trying to make some upgrades over the past few weeks so that we can reach more people, because we think what we have to say is interesting, and we've got some great guests on. Today we're not going to disappoint either.
No, we have Duncan Wood, who is the director of the Mexico Institute at the Mexico Center at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Your old job, Julian, right?
Yes. Yeah, he took it over from me in 2008. But I have fond memories. Hello, everybody from the Institute.
No, we're just kidding, but it's great to be online and to talk about things. For anybody who's joining us from outside of Mexico City, we are in day 946 of quarantine. Actually, yesterday marked my 2-month anniversary of being in quarantine.
What'd you do to celebrate?
What did I do to celebrate? I stayed in.
Yeah. Amazing, man.
I basically stayed in and watched the ESPN documentary, which we're going to have some great people to talk about that on in a future show.
Yeah.
And our guests are varied and random. If you've been tuning into our podcasts in the past, our guests have ranged from our favorite Mickey from Molotov to
drag queens
to the
news anchors,
the famous wrestler from Canada,
El Vampiro Canadiense,
and talking about some of his struggles and his successes here in Mexico. So basically a lot of really interesting people that are doing things in Mexico in English because I don't think there's many things in English here in the city for people to listen to.
Yeah, not too much for the local population, and even Mexico City is one of the biggest cities of the world. It's a world capital, and for the world to know about the English community in Mexico City, there isn't much content as well. So that was kind of one of the motivations in creating this podcast show, opera. Yeah.
Podcast. Well, tell us if you have a better name for the show. Write it in the comments sections. We can see your comments. And shout out to Jorge, which is our La Lore and tonight in our drag queen bingo that we'll be hosting at 8:00 p.m. Right here on Facebook Live and Zoom. We'll give you more information about the drag queen bingo later on. But how you doing, Jorge? Hopefully you're getting ready for tonight's festivities, right?
Yeah. So actually, I think we kind of just jumped into it. By the way, guys, I'm Julian. If you don't know me, this is Dan, the Pinche Gringo. And we have been doing this show for almost a year now. Maybe not quite that much, but this is episode 33. So yeah, so it was time for us to upgrade. So we got a great show up today. It's a beautiful day here in Mexico City, but as Dad mentioned, we are in special times. Coronavirus is on the rise, new cases every day, and the situation in the hospitals is getting a little bit more precarious and overflowing. Dan, I know you've been able to actually firsthand get a look at the hospitals. What are your impressions over there?
Well, I've only been outside, and we're very excited at Pinche Gringo to be running the Barbecue for Heroes campaign, which is basically pairing up our customers with the local hospitals in the area because we're smoking delicious meats. And I was on Bloomberg last night. So Cynthia, why don't you run the clip of a little bit of the Bloomberg interview?
Sí, gracias. Hacemos de los mejores sándwiches de brisket en toda la ciudad. Ahumamos 14 horas solo con humo y tenemos una manera para ofrecer los médicos nuestros héroes de sándwich de una vez cada semana para mejorar su día, porque imagínate, ellos están enfrente de todos en la batalla y podemos hacer poco amistad y enviar a ellos con nuestros clientes.
Muy bien, entonces una vez a la semana, ustedes desde este restaurante, por supuesto, muy conocido al sur.
So we're definitely trying to give out, we have these beautiful bags. Our team members are writing personalized notes to each of the healthcare workers. And we are assembling this food on Wednesdays and delivering it to the Centro Médico Hospital La Raza. It is a totally COVID hospital, and we need to definitely boost those. We're going to send 50 sandwiches today to the hospital workers. Last week we sent 150 sandwiches, and the prior 2 weeks before we sent 50 sandwiches each. So we've had a total of, I'm not a mathematician, but 300 sandwiches to the hospital workers that are there. Now, listen, we're not sending ventilators or equipment that they need. We're not doing everything that we possibly can do. But, you know, as I said on the show last night, I am not a doctor, and we're not in a position to buy equipment. But if we can send one medical professional a sandwich once a week, and that sandwich not only represents food that they can eat, but also a symbol of that we care.
Yeah.
And that we're thinking about them, and that there are people in the city that know that there are people out there that really, really appreciate what these medical professionals are doing on the ground.
Yeah, because I think being locked into our apartments or wherever we're staying, we know things are going on. We hear sirens. We know that we see news reports, but we don't really know what's going on always on the scene. But we at least know it's not an easy task right now, and people are risking their lives. And it's nice that you can give them a little bit of a nice lunch instead of having to just go to the hospital cafeteria, eat hospital food.
Well, you know, exactly. Well, actually, the cafeteria is closed, and they have ambulantes, the stalls outside the hospital that people can buy from. But, you know, these are tough times, and these doctors and nurses are working 16 hours a day inside the hospital. And then when they get out of the hospital, I think these are isolated reports. I'm not sure that this is happening all over the city. And I think it's just like certain people that have lack of information and are paranoid that there's been reports of nurses getting thrown bleach on their bodies, like as they're walking, harassment inside their apartment buildings because there are people afraid that they're going to contaminate the building. There were 2 nurses that were shot and killed in Torreon a couple of weeks ago. And we know that these guys are underpaid. We know that these are our first responders and are risking their life. There is a large percentage of hospital employees that are that are dying, actually. And not only the nurses and the doctors, but the people who clean, the administrators, you know, and the first responders that are picking up patients that don't have the necessary equipment. So I'm most preoccupied not about my own health. I mean, I'm taking care of myself, But I can't imagine, as you were just mentioning, that, I can't stand being in my apartment. It's so whatever, but I don't have to go out every day and risk my life to be able to, to save somebody else's life.
Yeah.
I think even for our employees at Pinche Gringo, and a big shout out to them, they're coming up, they're working up and going to work every day and exposing themselves to our customers, and then possibly exposing themselves to their family members that are at risk. But we all know, and they know, that the economic activity needs to continue. And as a restaurant, we are an essential business.
Yeah.
Because we're feeding a lot of people that need to eat. And for some people, it's a less risk to order from a restaurant than it is to go food shopping.
Yeah, true. And as long as restaurants like Pinche Gringo Barbecue are taking the appropriate measures to make sure that things are going to be safe, doing the best job we can, and people got to eat. So hope that you guys are all safe back at home. I know we've been kind of starting off with a bit of a serious tone. Sometimes we go a little more serious, sometimes we go a little bit more playful. But with our next guest on today, I don't know how it's going to be. We never really know how it's going to get more playful, if we're going to stay serious.
So let's move into that, and let's move into what we're going to be talking about today, about U.S.-Mexico relations. And there's two major topics that happened last week that we're going to talk about with our guest when he comes on the show. The number one thing is that the government had announced that it is going to stop with using renewable technologies and focus more on fossil fuels and others. And the legitimate argument about this was that the COVID virus has, for unprecedented times, and the investments have to shift. And so I think that has had a big uproar. I know a lot of people in the community have been setting up different types of campaigns and signatures online for people to do. And the other one is that we're seeing in the United States that the Trump administration has been talking publicly about the conditions and what's happening in Mexico. And what's been very interesting about this is that the number of deaths in Mexico are much, much more small than the United States. And it's only 1/3 of the US population. But we do not have 1/3 of the cases and deaths. But the other situation here is that, will the Trump administration use what's happening in Mexico as an argument to continue with one of his big campaign promises to build the wall, right? Mm-hmm. And so what's going to happen during the campaign season when he needs a wedge issue to divide different communities? And so in your political beliefs, we have different things. And let's get to the master, to the person who knows most about this, because he is the director of the Mexico Center of the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And we're happy to have him joining us live on the first ever Pinche Gringo podcast on Facebook Live and all of these other things, Mr. Duncan Wood. Duncan, how are you doing today, my friend? It's good to see you again. It's been a while. How's everything going on in Washington, D.C. right now?
Everything's going great, thanks. And thank you so much for having me. It's exciting to be here. Exciting to be part of this inaugural podcast. Wonderful.
Thanks. Yeah, it's our podcast number 33, but our first one, or our second one, we tested it last week, but our first real one that we're doing on Facebook Live with our more than 80,000 subscribers to our different pages in all of our universe. So thanks.
Well, I decided to dress appropriately, okay? I put on a little guayabera. I thought that, what does the gringo need in Mexico? That's the most important.
Well, I don't know what you're wearing on the bottom, but I'm glad on the top that you have a really nice...
it's the great mystery of these kind of calls. Nobody knows what anybody's wearing on the bottom. That's up to the imagination. But I do have to make one clarification, of course, that I'm not a gringo. I am English, so I am a Pinche Gringles, okay?
Nice. Pinche Gringlish, right? I guess in Argentina you'd be considered a gringo, but only in Mexico, or like specifically Americans gringo. Isn't that right?
It's much more nuanced, yes.
Yeah, I get labeled a gringo as a Canadian, and you just go with it. You're like, well,
we've been through this before,
like
Julian. Canada
almost.
might be like north of the United States, but it's just mostly the same.
I'll tell you, the funniest thing is when they confuse me with an Argentine in Mexico. Taxistas will often say to me, "Es usted argentino, señor?" And I say, "No soy inglés, pero soy mamón como un argentino."
Yeah,
absolutely, and they have much better steaks in Argentina than they do in the United States.
Very true. Sadly.
Duncan, let's get into it. We were just talking about and introducing. There are two major things that have been happening this week in the United States or in Mexico. Let's go to the first thing in Mexico that has happened, and I know this has a huge effect on what's happening in the United States as well. Is that the president's announcement that they are switching funding and investments from renewable energies such as solar energy and wind energy that Mexico has been leading for some time, and focusing it back into fossil fuels and other things. Can you talk more about what happened and what the effect will have on the relationship with the United States?
Yeah, just a couple of words of context. First of all, as you said, Mexico has long been seen as a leader in the renewable energy field, at least amongst emerging markets, developing countries. And, going way back to the early years of the Calderon presidency and then continuing through Peña Nieto, Mexico was a leader on climate change. Mexico became a leader on promoting renewable energy. Of course, after the energy reform in 2013, we saw huge amounts of investment going into renewable energy, particularly in electricity generation. We saw some very successful auctions taking place and billions of dollars going into the sector. What we've seen recently in the last couple of weeks under the AMLO administration is that there is an attempt to claw back that generation capacity from the private sector, and to make sure to try to promote the generating capacity of CFE, the Federal Electricity Commission. And we've seen this through a couple of directives. And first of all, basically the SENACE, which is the grid operator in Mexico, said that they would no longer be going out to perform tests on renewable energy generating plants so that they could actually connect to the system, which meant that if you weren't already connected to the system, this was going to be a problem for you. And then few days later, we saw new regulations, new guidances coming through, which suggest that the government really wants to put all of the responsibility for administering electricity back into the hands of CFE, which is how it was prior to the energy reform of 2013. Now, this raises a whole bunch of questions directly related to energy, but I would say more importantly, related to how investors view Mexico. And what it's generating is an enormous amount of uncertainty. And that's really what's freaking out analysts, investors, and of course, foreign governments as well. We've seen letters from the Canadian government. We've seen letters from the European Union. I know that there have been behind the scenes missives, communications from the United States government. This is causing a really big stink in diplomatic circles and, of course, in business circles and amongst investors.
Well, are these guys surprised, as this has been going on for some time, that the president is maybe going on to his own way and his agenda that he is very fervently holding on to, and it seems that he may not be willing to change that agenda in all of his priorities? Be in the shoes of the president. Why did the president make this decision, and what is he hoping to get out of it and to move forward with this decision?
Yeah, so I'm sure that the folks watching and listening to this will remember that it wasn't so long ago that President López Obrador, at one of his mañaneras, his morning press conferences, said that the pandemic had fallen like a ring onto his finger. That it was, in other words, this was a huge opportunity for him. And it left a lot of people puzzled, and they didn't understand what that meant. Well, I think that what the president sees and what a lot of the members of his party see is that in the middle of all this chaos, in the middle of all of this uncertainty, in the middle of a huge economic contraction, which is happening, there's an opportunity for the federal government to assert its power and to really move rapidly forward on the re-centralization of control over the economy in general into the hands of the federal government. So that's what I think is behind all of this. But if we look at it on a sort of on a more sector-specific basis, I would say that the move that we saw over the past week was not a surprise, but it was still a shock if you can have those two things living alongside each other. If we look at the relationship between López Obrador and investors, I mean, he didn't really care about what investors felt about the airport. He certainly didn't care that investors were saying that the refinery and the Tren Maya were not a good idea. He certainly hasn't paid a lot of attention to debt ratings agencies for Pemex or for the federal government. The Constellation Brands issue not so long ago. I mean, there's certainly a well-established pattern now where the president does what he wants to do, and the logic appears to be not driven by economic concerns, but certainly driven by political concerns. And that's why I think you find him time and time again talking about the pueblo, talking about what the people want, because he really doesn't care what the major investors think. Now, the contrast to that, of course, is that this is a president who has actively promoted the signing, ratification, and coming into force of the new USMCA, the NAFTA replacement. And he recognizes that that is something which is existentially important for the Mexican economy, that without that, Mexico will not be able to succeed, and therefore his administration would not be able to succeed. So I think that he has some sensitivity there, but only when he believes it's actually going to directly impinge upon his ability to govern.
Right. But he was really obsessed but he was also obsessed with keeping the peso at a certain rate as well.
Yeah, I mean, that we always said, didn't we, that there were two indicators that he really cared about. The first one was the peso, as you said, and a lot of us had speculated that maybe 25 to the dollar would be, a bridge too far for him. Well, we crossed that. We've come back over the bridge, but certainly he seemed to just brush that off as being directly connected to the pandemic and the uncertainty that's out there. The other indicator is, of course, his own approval rating. And we've seen that fall precipitously over the past couple of months. If you look at the Mitofsky tracking poll of presidential approval, it's around 50%. And other polls have him at about 10% higher. But the overall trajectory there has been downwards by about 20% since the beginning of the year. And again, a lot of us were speculating that maybe 50% was the tipping point for him to become concerned. Well, it's certainly stabilized over the last 2 to 3 weeks at around that 50% approval rating mark. And so he seems to be holding steady onto that and to say, you know what, I'm still in control. This is my opportunity to consolidate and centralize power. And I still have the support of around 50% of the population. Now, whether that holds throughout the pandemic, throughout, whenever the peak of the pandemic is in Mexico, and certainly whether that continues to hold through the economic recession that we're going to see because of this, is up for question. But I do think that, he is going to pay a price for the collapse of the Mexican economy. If we see a drop in GDP for the year of more than 8%, then that will be seen by a lot of folks in the public as a failure.
And will he still continue with his, and our viewers who don't know this, the president early on with a sky high approval rating, and as many of our guests have pointed out before, much similarities with Donald Trump, which Donald Trump famously said that if I walked down Fifth Avenue in the afternoon and shot somebody, they would still love me and vote for me. And kind of taking the same road of announcing that even though the Mexican president is a 6-year term, that after 3 years, he will have a referendum on his presidency. And if they vote to recall him, he will step down, which is not constitutionally binding, not something that is going to be run by the Federal Election Commission. But will he still go through with this referendum, even though his approval ratings are dropping considerably?
I mean, all the signs are that he will. You did say something very, very important, that it may not be constitutionally binding. But AMLO does appear to be a man of his word, or at least he's he's made every effort to show that he is a man of his word with the promises that he made before the election. He hasn't followed through on everything, of course, but he's tried to convince the public that he has. And I think that the comparison with with Trump and his statement about being able to do pretty much whatever he wants, I think it's true for right now about 30% of the Mexican electorate who will vote for AMLO no matter what, because he is seen as being their savior. But there's another 20% of people who still give him their approval, who I think that's a soft approval at this point in time. And as if things get a lot worse, then they're likely to desert him. And one thing that he has in his favor is, of course, that he continues to provide cash transfers to the poorer folks in Mexico. By one estimate, almost 50% of the Mexican population benefits from some kind of federally mandated transfer. And so he's able to, through federally mandated transfer or the increase in the minimum wage that we've seen. And so he's still very popular amongst that 50% that really has benefited from his administration. But of course, if there is a massive destruction of jobs in Mexico, in particular in the informal sector, then a lot of folks are going to be looking for an alternative.
And we're going to have to see what's happening, right? And it's a pretty interesting thing about how things are going to change in the next couple of months. Can we switch? Let's switch gears for a little bit and go to the U.S. politics as it refers to Mexico, because the American in the United States, there is going to be an election at the end of the year. The president has used Mexico as a wedge issue in his campaign 4 years ago, declaring the wall and building the wall and immigration policy. And I guess it's not chatter, but it's the president's usage of Twitter, where he can make little comments here and there that he's starting to mention things about, number one, that Mexico is not handling the virus well, and that there are people becoming infected, and using that and immigration to continue to talk about why he should build the wall, and not anymore about keeping out immigrants, but about keeping out sick people, because he's making a declaration that Mexico is in chaos, whereas the number of deaths and total sick in Mexico is so much smaller in comparison to what's happening in the US right now. What are your thoughts on this, and how is he going to use this as an issue moving forward?
Listen, I think that we've seen that, obviously we're firmly in campaign season now. And we've seen statements from this administration in the United States saying that the current border restrictions are going to continue indefinitely. We've seen decisions being taken that, for example, no new green cards are going to be issued, and H-1B visas are being held up as well. We've seen efforts being made to turn back migrants that are found having crossed the border in an undocumented way are being returned immediately to Mexico rather than being detained first of all. That's a huge change. So this is, I think that some of these measures make sense, but there's an obvious temptation here for an administration that says that it's tough on immigration, that it's tough on border issues, to continue these for as long as they can. And I think that, certainly these measures allow President Trump and now candidate Trump to be able to say, look, I am tough on the border. I am tough on immigration. I'm building the wall. Yes, I mean, there's very little of it actually having been built so far. But he now has a number of things that he can talk about. He's begun construction on the wall. He's got Mexico to play the role of collaborating and controlling Central American migration. He's got the Remain in Mexico program in place. He's negotiated third country agreements with a number of Central American countries. And now he's got these other controls to do with, H-1Bs, green cards, etc., as well as the border restrictions. And I think that, he can quite legitimately say that he has now a stellar track record in terms of controlling the U.S. border, better than anybody else in recent history. And if you're the kind of person that likes that, then that's a very appealing platform. And you can say, look, he delivered for us. Of course, under very unique circumstances. I think probably the more intriguing question is, what would we see with a Biden presidency? If Biden was to win the election, would we see a relaxation of these restrictions on the border, of remain in Mexico? And I'm not sure that we will in the short term. I think that there's going to be a lot of caution. There'll be a lot of trepidation about removing these restrictions too soon. Nobody wants to be held responsible for a flood of cases of coronavirus coming in across the border, for example. Nobody wants to be responsible for, or nobody wants to be accused of being too soft on illegal immigration. And certainly nobody wants to be accused of letting in criminals across the border, which is the common refrain that we hear here in the United States. So this is actually less about the questions of public health, and I think it's more about politics.
Well, it's going to be really interesting to see that we know that the big question in Mexico sometimes is, is a Trump presidency better for the Mexican economy because of his relationship with President López Obrador, or will a Biden presidency, will AMLO respond the exact same way with Biden? It doesn't matter who it is. What matters is that he maintains a good relationship, because he knows that the economic activity is more important than in some kind of egos. And it was funny that two megalomaniacs working together and getting and forging a good friendship has been really beneficial to both countries.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't use the same term as you do in terms of megalomaniacs. I think it's, I mean, they're certainly two unique politicians, but what we do see here is that, you know, they've reached an understanding at a certain level. And, you know, I mean, whether you agree with US and Mexican immigration policy right now and the fact that they've collaborated, this is unprecedented. I mean, we have never seen a Mexican administration cooperate so closely with the United States in the past. I mean, the closest we came to this was really during the Peña Nieto years, back around 2014, when the Mexican government instituted their southern border strategy, or Plan Frontera Sur, where they began to invest in infrastructure on the southern border of Mexico for the first time. But we've never seen anything like this before. And that has won López Obrador and his people a lot of friends in the current administration here in the US and in the Republican Party, despite the fact that obviously he is you know, much more left-leaning than they would normally be comfortable with. So it's an interesting situation. Let me just put one other thing on the table, if I can, and that is that, of course, we still haven't heard whether or not this meeting is going to take place between AMLO and Trump at some point. AMLO said that when, you know, he was negotiating with Trump over ventilators, that he had suggested that they should have a person-to-person meeting. And that's still out there. I haven't really heard very much about it here in Washington. A colleague of mine this morning shared with me a rumor that there is talk about it happening actually on the border. But I think that's going to be dictated about by concerns over domestic political factors, rather than whether or not there's a real desire on the part of both presidents to get together.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up the ventilators, because I was going to ask you about basically the relationship between Mexico and the USA right now. And I don't know about any new measures implemented in the USMCA. Is there a lot of room for a lot of humanitarian exchange between the United States and Mexico, and perhaps vice versa?
Yeah, so you know, a few weeks ago, from the Wilson Center, myself and a colleague, Andrew Rudman, published a piece on titled "Pandemics or Beyond Pandemics," and we looked at the institutional mechanisms that are in place for the United States, Mexico, and Canada to cooperate during a pandemic, and they were really put together, those guidelines and that plan, which is called the North American Plan for Animal and Pandemic Influenza, or NAPAPI, was put in place initially after the respiratory pandemics of the early 2000s, you know, SARS, etc. And then, of course, received a major review after the H1N1 outbreak in the around 2008, 2009. And it's had a couple of updates since then after Ebola outbreaks, etc. And, you know, a lot of people expected that this might be used in the current pandemic. But the pandemic overtook countries so quickly that there really wasn't any discussion of how this particular pandemic cooperation plan could be put into force. We did see it being used to communicate between governments, to share statistics and data as much as possible. But we didn't see, for example, the sharing of stockpiles of medicine or of equipment, largely because they didn't exist beforehand. So I think that what we're going to see after this pandemic is a review of those institutional mechanisms for cooperation, and an attempt certainly to begin to stockpile personal protective equipment and certain kinds of medicine that can be used. And the question of ventilators becomes especially pertinent here. And who knows whether the next pandemic will be a respiratory disease of some kind. But I think that as we saw in the early stages of this pandemic, there were severe shortages of ventilators, and there was a problem with the distribution of those ventilators. Obviously, we needed to get a lot more into New York more quickly than we were able to in the early stages, and now we're probably going to need to get a lot more into Mexico. So what would be intriguing would be to see if either national governments, state governments begin to stockpile this kind of equipment, or whether the federal government can come up with some mechanism to actually share that equipment. Of course, Mexico is a major producer of medical devices in general. We've seen firms like Medtronic, doing a lot of business in Mexico, producing a lot of their equipment. And it's not just the finished article, but of course the components that go into ventilators, the final product that would cross the border first of all and then get assembled in the US. And so there is a very, very important, a vital or essential supply chain that we need to protect as well. And that's something which I think we need to revisit and evaluate after this pandemic, because we haven't done
it seems like
job.
Of course, and it seems like that the United States is pressuring Mexico to reopen, because there are factories in the US that have reopened, but they have to shut down again because they're relying on parts, especially in the audio industry, from Mexico to be able to ship there. And it seems like there's a big conflict by national policy that if Mexico is still shutting down and because we are 3-4 weeks behind of other countries, then there's becomes a conflict there.
Yeah, it's such a difficult issue because, of course, nobody wants to see people dying unnecessarily because we're producing cars for sale in the United States. Nobody wants to see Mexican workers sacrifice their lives because of that. That is not a good trade-off. But in fact, that's not the question. The question is, if Mexican factories don't go back online soon and provide those components, US manufacturers are going to look elsewhere. And if they're looking elsewhere, they may well forge relationships with other components manufacturers that will endure beyond the pandemic. And that is a real threat to the integrated production platform in North America. And I think that's where we need to be sensitive to the long-term interests of not just the United States, but also of Mexico and the North American region.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty mind exploding a little bit. It makes me think too about the implications for a vaccine too, and how these three countries would share those stockpiles as well.
Yeah, I mean, the vaccine question, of course, is there. There's the Gilead drug, remdesivir. I mean, everyone is anxious to see more of that treatment being produced. And at a certain point, there is competition at the international level between countries to be the first to be able to produce a viable vaccine. And so it's going to become a very sensitive issue in this regard. But I think that what we do also need to do is we need to have a North American conversation about how do we secure those supply chains during pandemics and beyond. There is a huge tendency right now towards nearshoring. With a lot of companies are now saying we cannot depend upon China anymore. It's too far away. It's out of our control. We can trust Mexico and Canada. So therefore, let's try to bring some of that production closer to home, if not home directly. And if that's going to be the case, then we need to have a conversation about, the worker safety, the conditions in the workplace, and in addition to how is the economy, and this gets us way beyond what we're talking about right now, but how is the economy going to be affected in the long term on a structural basis by this pandemic? And how do we begin to retrain the workforce to take advantage of that? because ultimately what we're looking at here is an accelerated structural change in the economies of North America. Digital platforms have proven to be absolutely essential. We're seeing a rapid move towards automation and the use of robots in factories. And for the human workers that continue in those factories, we need to make sure that they are protected. So putting more space between them, plastic screens, etc., all of those things need to be discussed. And I think it's time that we actually had a North American conversation about that, so that we can protect not just the manufacturers themselves, but the workers who work in their factories.
And that's very interesting. A big transformation coming with, and it's great that we have a new bilateral trade agreement that's a bit more flexible than NAFTA to be able to do it. I have two more questions for you that we have to wrap up, Duncan, because we can talk to you for hours. It's really interesting to get a different perspective on this. The one thing is that about 2 months ago on an earlier podcast, I had suggested that Mexico wouldn't be affected as much because of our incessant use of pine sol and other things. I was tongue-in-cheek joking about it, and then the president a couple of weeks ago had announced that maybe disinfectants and cleaners in our systems would potentially kill the virus. So can we produce enough pine sol in Mexico to allow the president to distribute pine sol to all Americans to stop this virus for the future?
I'm not sure if pine sol is going to cut it, to be honest with you. I think it may have to be Fabuloso. Because Fabuloso is a smell that reminds me of Mexico more than anything else. But
or Mr. Musculo.
Right? That could work too, yes.
Or Mr. Clean. Duncan, you are a very often here in Mexico City. You come a lot. I know this. What do you miss most about the city?
It's funny. I go through phases. To begin with, I missed. Well, it was jacaranda season at the beginning of this pandemic, and I missed the jacarandas. I then began to miss tacos like you wouldn't believe, and so I began downloading recipes, by the thousands of how to try to make tacos al pastor, because that was the one thing that I really, really missed. I ended up making some half decent tacos al pastor. Yeah, I had the trompo and everything. It was kind of amazing, but it's not the same. And
even
I know this
restaurants in DC don't make the same type of taste like Rosa Mexicana and some of these famous eateries in DC, because I think it's more of a Central American populations that are cooking Mexican food for Americans who think it's lettuce and American cheese on their tacos.
Yeah, exactly. And I know this sounds rather trite and cliched, but honestly, I miss Mexico right now, and I miss Mexicans. One of the things that a lot of people have talked about now is how this is going to impact upon the way that we relate to people in person. Mexico has always been the country of abrazos y besos.
Yeah.
Is that going to change? Because I miss that. It's one of the reasons why I love going to Mexico, is that you actually have a human connection with people. And, I would hate to see that disappear from Mexican culture.
I don't think it's going to disappear, because I'm getting kissed on the street still, in random places with my mask on. But
you're a good looking boy though. So,
Oh, thanks, Duncan. Well, on that note, thanks so much for coming on the show, Duncan. Duncan Wood, director of the Mexico Institute for the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and a huge friend of Mexico. And hopefully you'll come soon, Duncan, and have some brisket with us in the future when everything gets back to. Thank you, Duncan, for being on the show today. Thanks a lot, guys. Be well. Cheers.
Thanks, Duncan. You too.
So sometimes every guest that we have scares us a little bit.
Yeah.
And
well, that wasn't as scary as more as it was kind of like, oh yeah, forgot about the economy. that thing's gonna have to change.
We'll have to have Anna Maria back on around scary season to tell us that things are, security situation is going down.
Some nice bedtime stories.
Yeah. And, I know we live in a bubble, Julian. There's 2 different Mexicos in Mexico City. And I don't know for sure, what's really happening in some of our poor communities. But here, I think things are pretty stable and safe. And we're rounding to the conclusion of our intense quarantining, not the conclusion of the pandemic, but I see that there is a light where we're going to start resuming, because I know that now the world is struggling between, do you keep staying at home and make sure that there are no deaths, or do you allow deaths to happen but to get the economy moving again, because there's more destruction in the economy by shutting down. And it's a very hard decision to make when it has lives. But these are decisions that our politicians, that we don't have to make, but our politicians are making. And I guess, as general citizens, Mexico, as I've shared with you before, and this is a good segue into our next segment, has taken the approach of it's voluntary, take caution if you can, but there is an understanding that there are a lot of people that rely on having to go to work and making money to feed their families. And the government is not cutting people off from doing that and allowing economic activity to still be taking place somewhat, even though there is a lot of risk to that and outbreaks and everything. And so I want to bring back on our next guest on it, Matt Macinnes. Matt Macinnes is a good friend, and this is continuing our segment of Around the World with all of our friends to talk about what they've been experiencing in the pandemic. And Matt, there is nothing more different than Mexico's approach to the pandemic than what has happened in Panama. Now, just to let you all know that in Panama, that women can only go out on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and men could only go out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And with the number of your IFE, it would determine exactly what hours that you can go out in a 2-hour limit. And they were checking your passports and checking everything. Matt, tell us more about this. And in Panama's incredibly demanding quarantine policies that are completely different than what we see in Mexico.
Hey, Dan, and hi, Julian. It's great to see you guys, and thanks for having me. Yeah, it's been an interesting experience. And so Panama basically decided, as you were saying, it's a 2-hour window. For men, it was also 3 days a week to begin with. We had Saturdays, and they took that away from us because they were arresting about 900 people a day were getting arrested.
Right.
And
all the day were arrested.
And about 900 every day were getting arrested for breaking the curfew, for being outside on the wrong day or the wrong time. And they figured out that 90% of those were men or males. So they decided to take our Saturdays away, moved us down to Tuesday, Thursday. And so that's all part of the strict lockdown. They started Ley Seca here in late March. They closed the airport to any national and international flights in March 22nd, I think it was. They've just extended that now through June 22nd. And so it's serious. And, I feel safe here, but it's getting to that point now, as you guys were just saying, of how do you reactivate the economy and work and life and education and exercise. And so they're now at block 2 of the phase of getting back to reality, with block 6 being once there's a vaccine or a treatment. And so it's a slow process. They've just opened Ley Seca about 2 weeks ago. They allowed us to start buying alcohol and consuming again. And so you can buy 6 beers, 1 wine, or 1 bottle of liquor in the supermarket. And they gave men Saturdays back last week. So those are the gradual relaxation that we're under. One other thing they've just started is they said, so kids were not allowed to go outside at all throughout any of this. And many people in Panama live in high-rise apartments, and so kids are often not getting any fresh air. They don't have a balcony. They don't have a backyard or anything to go in. And so kids were just allowed last week to go out with their parent, with one child during that 2-hour window. And so that's one way it's been loosened recently. And now you're allowed to exercise outside during that 2-hour window, as long as you stay close to your house and you wear a face mask. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they loosen this and how we move out of the strict quarantine we're in.
Yeah, geez, that sounds quite stricter than here. And poor kids. I mean, that's another thing too about reopening the economy. Like, think about the children that are stuck in high-rise buildings, not having any fresh air. I would have lost my mind as a 7-year-old child during this whole thing. I was thinking as well too, maybe I think a lot of our listeners identify Panama with the canal, and it being such an international gateway. I'm not really familiar with how it works when you have workers from boats that come from different countries, if they're allowed to touch land as they go through the canal or anything. But do you know if the canal has taken any precautions to contain the spread of the virus in Panama?
Yeah, so it's Panama is considered one of the hubs of the Americas, not just the canal, but also the airport here is kind of a stopgap as people come and go as well. So that puts this country at more risk than many others in Central America, I guess. And the canal did have a pretty famous case a couple of weeks ago where there was a cruise ship that had a number of positive cases, and they were looking to get people off the cruise ship, and a number of countries rejected this cruise ship from even getting access. And so Panama ended up coming to an agreement with them where they allowed them to move passengers from one ship to another, and it all happened 5 kilometers off the shore from Panama. But yeah, the canal itself is really just a gateway. So it's really just a passage that boats go through, and people, generally don't come off and on those beyond some of those workers. And so I believe it's become a lot stricter. And I also believe that traffic has gone down quite a bit. I believe up to about 30% less traffic has been passing recently.
It's going to be interesting to see after this is all over and all the analysis comes out of what the right strategy was. Was it the Swedish way? Was it the Mexican way? Was it the Panamanian way? Or is each country different in kind of what their decision is and how many lives should be sacrificed for letting people go on with their daily lives? And it seems like Panama's really taking that approach where, every life is important and we're going to shut everything down and lock people down until the end. How are people getting about, your friends, the people that you communicate on a daily basis in Panama? How has affected their psyche? Because it seems like, I don't think Mexico would ever be able to handle or implement what Panama is implementing right now.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the strengths for Panama. It's such a small country. And with the makeup of this country, it's not really a north to south, it's more of an east to west country. And to go anywhere from the city, for example, you need to cross the bridge. So they talk about going to the interior, going to the mountains, going to the beach, you have to cross this bridge. So they've been able to basically keep people where they are. They've been able to close the bridges.
Shut the bridge down.
And they've been able to have a control of who is where. And you need a permit to go different places. You need a permit to go to work. You need a permit to be anywhere outside of your 2 hours. And they'll put you to jail if you break these rules. They'll throw you in jail for 24 hours. They're now giving people community service.
No more vidas in Panama, right?
Yeah, I think they're getting stricter. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it's been easier to control than in a country the size of Mexico for sure. And it's also been easier for them to manage the hospital system as well. So they built a new hospital as soon as they saw this coming. And they're only at about 45% capacity in ICU wards. So they've had a pretty good control of that. And the deaths are still less than 300. And so
amazing.
Mortality rate's pretty healthy so far, but they're testing a lot. We have about 9,000 cases here, which is really high for Central America. But Panama are kind of proud of that because they're actually testing. A lot of countries are saying they're in a good place, but they're not actually testing rigorously. So,
have you been tested, Matt?
I've not, no.
And if you want to get a test in Panama, is it easy to get one?
No, not yet. And that's something, I work in an international school and we're looking at reopening in phases. And so at first phase, we want to bring back our operational staff, and then we want to bring the teachers back. And then once we're allowed to get the kids back. And we're looking at ways of, can we implement some kind of rule that you need to be tested before you get back? And then how will that work? Because in Germany, anyone can get a test it's about $40. But that's obviously not quite available yet in this part of the world.
So when do you think that Panama will reopen again? Do you think it'll happen earlier than other countries that have taken a lax effort? I mean, is this what they're talking about?
I guess it depends what the definition of reopening is. So they've defined phase block 6 as back to the old normal. That's when they open nightclubs. That's when they open casinos, concerts, live sporting events, and education's in that block as well of when kids go back to school. And that will be when there's treatment or a vaccine, unless we go a long time without that. And so we're even preparing to perhaps not see kids again at school until maybe January.
Wow, that's amazing. Matt, stay safe, be strong. I just want to let you know that I bought a bag of peach rings on Sunday, and I was thinking about you when I was eating them the other day. So hope to see you back in Mexico soon with us. Matt Macinnes, expat living in Panama. Thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thank you, guys. Great to see you both. Take care.
All right. So yeah, and another country down on the country list.
Yeah,
and a very different approach to all of this.
I don't know if any of you are like me. If I only had a 2-hour slot to go out every week, I mean, I wouldn't try and break the rules, but I just know I would forget something somewhere and feel the need, like my charger for my computer. Crap, forgot it at my friend's house. I guess I wouldn't be going out.
Well, 6 hours a week, right? So 2 hours every other day, and nobody's allowed out on Sundays. It's just absolutely amazing to see a country in such a very much more extreme. And we talked to Rafaela from Israel a couple of weeks ago who said, 150 meter radius from your house. We talked to someone from Spain where only one person can be out at a time. And we've talked to all over the world in all this. And you know what? We should get some. I know someone from Italy. We should get her on the show and hear what's going on there. So Julian, we're running out of time. It's
a long one.
It's a long one today, and we're going to wrap it up. So let's talk about things that are happening at the Gringo or around Pinche Gringo at this time.
Yeah. Fortunately, the restaurants, we're still doing all right, and we are open for business. As you know, in Mexico, it's not the same as in other countries, like in Panama. But tonight, celebrating the 3rd anniversary of Warehouse, we have a big Drag Queen Bingo live stream that will be transmitted from our Facebook page on live. And if you want to participate, you still have a bit of time. You'll have to make an order from any of the Pinche Gringo locations. We're going to include some bingo cards in the order, and you'll be sent an email shortly with the Zoom link to be able to participate. So that's happening tonight. We got 5 bottles of Puerto de Indias Black that are going to be raffled off, or
Black?
One off. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's not quite the gin, the strawberry gin we work with. It has some darker flowers in it. I've never tried it before, but we have 5 bottles. We have 5 rounds of bingo, so it's kind of a very special bingo night tonight. You can see the ticker down here on the bottom. That's a cool new feature we have on the Pinche Gringo podcast. So Thursday, we have a special promo. That's tomorrow. If you make an order from the Warehouse of 2,000 pesos or more, maybe you're thinking of getting some meat in vacuum sealed for the weekend or whatever, but we'll throw in a bottle of Tradicional tequila from Jose Cuervo. So that's orders of 2,000 pesos or more made directly from the Warehouse. It's ley seca. If you're running dry and you're getting a little desperate, this might be a pretty sweet deal. Also celebrating the Warehouse, we have, as Dan explained earlier in the show, the Barbecue for Heroes campaign, which is running continuously, but we want to highlight it this Friday, and we want to make a big push. So if you want to contribute, if you live in the United States, if you live here in Mexico, Panama, anywhere, you can make a donation. We have that posted on our comment sections too, if you want to find the link to make that donation. And then on the weekend, we have a special donut to celebrate our anniversary. We're doing this in collaboration with O Donas, who are an artisanal donut restaurant in La Roma. And for programming, we'll have stand-up comedy night on Saturday night, 8 p.m. I'll be hosting that, and inviting on to the show will be Martin Leon and Dan. So if you want to have some laughs, that's going to be streaming live from Instagram at the Pinche Bar Instagram account. It's fun. It's more of a casual conversation, not too different than this, but a lot funnier. Or a lot more funny. I don't know if that's a word.
It just wasn't a funny show today, but usually it's funny, right?
Yeah, usually we're hilarious.
Just like something new that we're doing.
We're saving our jokes.
We're trying to figure out what's going on here and like how to do this whole live streaming. So maybe next week will be a little bit more lighter. And we're getting Julian, grab me your Starbucks coffee.
Sure.
Because I just love that your name is Julian, and and they written the name Jolie. Or Jolly, because you're a very jolly. You're a jolly fellow, Julian.
I am pretty jolly. I'm jolie in French also. It means pretty.
Wow, some sophisticated international baristas there at Starbucks.
3 languages in
wow.
Starbucks signature. It always ends up being an interesting outcome when you tell them your name and you know they've never heard it before and they're just going to try their best. But God bless people at Starbucks too who are serving us coffees and croissants and sandwiches.
That's it.
I'm not eating those, but
well, listen. Let's let our 7 people that are people that we paid from the team to be on the show today. Thank you, guys. That aren't even guys. Exactly. But thank you all for watching the show today. We're going to be doing even more and more and more with this format, and so stay tuned to more exciting Pinche Gringo podcasts in the future. Your news in Mexico in English. I'm Dan DeFossi at Pinche Gringo Dan.
And I'm Julian Valois at Snappy Jules on Instagram.
Have a great night, everybody.
Go Chiefs.